Hey, good morning, SBC 205. It is April 22nd, 2019, 10 o'clock in the morning. And this is your review for your final exam. Of historic note, April 22nd is the anniversary, 143 years ago today, of the first National League baseball game. The game was played between the then Philadelphia Athletics and the Boston Braves. The Braves would win 6-5. Thus ensuring their note in history, and the fact that they would later become one of the worst baseball teams in history. But today, 143 years ago, April 22nd, first professional baseball game in the National League between the Philadelphia Athletics and the Boston Braves, which would go on to lead us. It was known then as the National Association, would become the National League, and ultimately lead to Major League Baseball. So great historic date for us all here in the United States with our national pastime. Okay, so let's jump into the review. What I have here are my lecture notes, and I use my lecture notes, and I also go back in and look at the chapters you were supposed to read in the book. So what you need to be doing, and those are where I derive the test questions from, so you're going to need to do more than this. You're going to need to go back into the textbook and relook all those chapters we were supposed to read, okay? Just look at your syllabus. They're all listed there, all right? What I'll do is I'm going to go through each of these and sort of highlight areas where I will probably be drawing test questions, okay? So you'll know where I'm going to be looking at. Not all of these areas will be test question, will I get questions out of. And some of these I may draw several questions out of, but this is just sort of a general area for you to go back and look at your notes, get with your classmates if you don't think your notes are in depth enough, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. If we go back to our very first lecture, we discussed communication, human communication. We discussed why we publicly speak, what the requirement is for it. We talked about the three main purposes of public speaking: to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. We talked about the human communication process, and that the main requirement was that you needed at least two willing participants or knowing participants within that. We talked about the message. We talked about channels. We talked about feedback. We talked about several models. And we talked about the linear model from Shannon and Weaver, the interactional model from Schramm, the transactional model, and then we talked about some of the more complex ones, and including the one my favorite is the helical model. We discussed that. Then we discussed a couple of clear things, characteristics of human communication. That human communication always exists in a social context. I stressed that human communication is irreversible, and then I talked a lot about what that actually meant. I talked that human communication has rules that we have all agreed on, at least implicitly, that human communication is a learned behavior, and that language is arbitrary. Remember, we talked about subject-sign relationships. We talked about ethical models right off the bat as well. We talked about ends justify the means. We talked about situational ethics. And then we really focused on credibility-centered ethics. Remember, we talked about ethos, pathos, and logos as a way to persuade, and ethos being that credibility-centered ethical model. Okay, that's that. That's all for that. Okay. Then we talked about performance apprehension. Everybody remembers the performance apprehension. We talked about the causes of performance apprehension. The first we talked about the biological reasons, flight, fight, freeze. Everybody remembers that. We talked about your previous experiences giving public speeches. And in public speaking events, we talked about your level of skill and the training you receive before you're thrown into the mix, so to speak. We talked about how to deal with it. We stressed developing a communication versus performance frame of mind, which stressed that even if you focus on getting your message across as opposed to how well you do it, if you focus on the message and not the performance, it will be better. We talked about relaxation exercise. We talked about some cognitive restructuring. And then we talked about some specific things like prepare, practice out loud, dress appropriately, focus on the message. Remember, it's going to get better fairly quickly, and then let your nonverbals convince yourself. Remember, Amy Cuddy's "Fake it till you make it." Okay, that might be on the test. And then remember, everyone should have seen this. Our performance apprehension stages. Okay, that should look familiar to you. If not, it should be posted on the Blackboard pages in the documents section so you can look at that. Be aware, I always love asking questions about performance apprehension stages. Okay, next we bounced over to choosing your topic. Okay, remember that choosing your topic is the first opportunity you have to take control of your speech. You may not get to pick where you're speaking, when you're speaking, or who you're speaking to, but even though you may have a broad sort of topic, details of the topic and what you intend to do with that topic are all on you, okay? So it's the first opportunity you have to really take control of the public speaking event, okay? You should consider these things, and we talked about them in detail: the speaker, the occasion, the audience, okay? Remember, speaker is first. Because if you focus on the audience, you're not going to play to your strengths. So focus on the speaker, the occasion, and then the audience. Remember, there are three, and we've already discussed that on this event. The three general purposes of your speech is to entertain, to inform, and to persuade. To entertain, to perform, and to persuade. And then we ran through some examples of finding a specific purpose for a speech. Okay? All right, and then we did outlining. Everybody should remember outlining. Looks familiar, right? Okay. Remember that outlining is there for you to visualize the structure of your speech. It's there to make sure your speech is well balanced. It's there to show you how you're using your evidence, and it's well placed. All right. Everybody should remember the first thing that goes in your outline. That's right, your attention device. Okay. Then we talked in detail, and we talked about the audience, and we talked about audience analysis. We started off with that great quote from Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House. In America, all politics are local, and we discussed why that's important to us as public speakers. Okay, we talked about demonstrating relevance to the audience, either through timeliness, proximity, and personal impact. You know, again, with proximity, we use that, that people may not care about Vanuatu being flooded and just disappearing as a nation in the Pacific Islands, but if you can show that erosion in Charleston is going to cost millions of dollars to us in South Carolina, that's going to have more impact. Personal impact and timeliness should all be obvious. We talked about analyzing the initial audience disposition, where they are at the start, and that way you can understand exactly how you need to move them to where they're going to. Okay? We talked about methods of analysis. We talked about demographic. We talked about psychographic, which involves values and opinions. We talked about situational analysis, like audience size and the occasion. We talked about purpose-oriented analysis. Okay? And everybody should remember all of those. We talked about sources of data for audience analysis. Remember, local TV stations, local newspapers, conversations you can have with local people, public opinion polls, interviews with people, and then we talked about your ultimate success is going to depend a great deal on your personal credibility with that audience. So you need to identify what is going to make you more credible with that audience. Okay? All right. See if there's anything else on here I really want to... Yeah. Last thing is audience adaptation, which is don't change your basic message. Okay, but remember, through audience analysis, we learn more about the audience, and we learn more about what's going to make you an effective speaker to those individual audience members. So we focus on that, okay? A little coffee. Okay. Next, we bounced over to organization. Okay? We showed a lot of evidence that organization will help, and it's been proven. It's been a concept that's been around for almost 3,000 years, but it was really proven 70 years ago in great detail that organizing your speech will make your speech easier to remember. Remember how we talked about you can't go back and reread a speech. They have to have a framework as you walk into it to get it all nailed down. We talked about ways to organize. We talked about chronological, a narrative order, which is rooted in in narrative theory. Telling a story is easy to remember. We talked about topic order, things that made sense, spatial patterns, causal patterns, which is cause and effect, like your problem solution speeches. Okay, motivated sequence. Remember there was multiple steps: attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. Remember those 5 steps of the motivated sequence. Okay. Again, I'm not going to ask you to name all 5, but I would be aware that action, as we've talked about with persuasive speech, action is what you need the audience to do at the end. Okay. Satisfaction is to show your plan to eliminate the need. Okay. We've gone over that in multiple other speeches in building. Okay. Next, we talked about methods of presentation. We talked about reading from a manuscript, when you read from a manuscript, why you would read from a manuscript, and things to remember when you read from a manuscript. Okay, remember you're not just staring at the page. We talked about speaking from memory and when you would speak from memory and some advantages and disadvantages to that. We talked about impromptu speaking. Okay, and you remember that even though you're not having a lot of time to plan, you need to try to build some organization, even basic organization, into an impromptu speech. And then we talked about extemporaneous speaking, okay, which is the one we advocate and we used here in class, or at least we tried to use here in class. And remember, we listed a whole bunch of advantages to extemporaneous speaking. And we also pointed out that extemporaneous speaking needs more practice, not less practice, than any of the other ones, okay? Oh, wow, here's my piece on outlining. Let's go over that again, make sure I got everything. You outline so you can visualize the speech, so you can test the scope of the content, so you can test the logical relationships of the main points, and so you can test your supporting ideas to make sure you have evidence in all the appropriate spaces. Okay? You test the balance and the proportionality of the speech, and it assists in developing your note cards. Okay. Then we talked about use of evidence. Okay? We talked about why, when, how, and what to use in evidence. Okay? We talked about opinions of others. We talked about statistics and how to quote statistics. We talked about sources of evidence. Okay? Personal knowledge. We talked about primary research, secondary research. Know the difference between primary and secondary research. Okay? And then we talked about some guidelines, like using a wide variety, choose appropriate forms, make sure your evidence is relevant. Don't use too much evidence, because remember, your ethos and your personal credibility is based on you being smart on the topic, not just the fact that you can read off a whole bunch of other sources. And then finally, we stress, do not manipulate your evidence, because you will eventually get caught, and that will end your ability to persuade in the future. Then we talked about delivery. Okay? We talked about how you develop note cards, how to hold your note cards. We talked about the characteristics of, and we stress one thing over and over again: never write your entire speech on your note cards. Never write your entire speech on your note cards. Okay. Then we talked about the characteristics of the voice, which were pitch, volume, rate, and quality. Okay. We talked about articulation. How's your mama in? You should know how that applies. Okay. We talked about vocalized pauses. You should know what that is. Then we talked about some physical behaviors. We talked about eye contact. We talked about posture. We talked about movements. And the one thing we stressed in movements is all movements should be motivated. Period. Okay? Then we talked a little bit about clothing. I would be aware of that, but I wouldn't get too bent out of shape about it. Remember the fact that we said about clothing was the clothing should make sure that you're comfortable. Okay? Then we went into chapter 16, speaking to inform. Okay? And the fact that an informative speech has one purpose, and that is to convey knowledge. Not to persuade, not to do anything else. It's just to move knowledge from A to B. We talked about why we do informative speaking. We talked about some key concepts such as adjust your content to the audience, avoiding jargon, because if you have specific vocabulary and you're there to convey knowledge, you can bet your audience doesn't have that vocabulary. We talked about limiting the information you present because you can't tell everybody everything all at once. They just can't absorb it. Then we talked about building on previous knowledge, be memorable, make it relevant to the people, and be personal. Okay? That will be about that. Then we talked about language. We talked about meaning. We talked about two different types of meaning. We talked about denotative, okay, which comes from a dictionary, and connotative, which comes from context. You remember? Denotative, dictionary, connotative, context. That's an easy way to remember that. Okay? A lot of times we transition from denotative to connotative. Like we talked about Black Friday. Black is a color, but Black Friday is also a color, but it has a more bigger meaning. Okay? Then we talked about how an individual's engagement with the environment can change the meaning of things. Remember, we went over a list of 12 different characteristics, differences between written and oral communication. Okay, wrote them on the board. Remember, like oral language is a smaller variety of words. Oral language has words with fewer syllables, has shorter sentences, more self-referencing words. Okay, you need to be aware of those 12. I always like looking at those 12s. Okay, a lot of times it will be all of these are characteristics of oral communication, except. There you go. There's a question. I guarantee you there's going to be a question like that on the final. Okay, we talked about similes and metaphors, and then we talked about the one of those things you want to avoid, which is hyperbole. All right? We talked about rhythm, parallelism, repetition. Okay, rhythm, parallelism, repetition. Okay, and alliteration is all effective use of language in communicating your ideas. Okay? And then we talked about adapt your language to the audience, always be professional, like there is never an instance during a public speech in anything that remotely resembles a professional environment where the F word is going to be okay. And then we talked about being inclusive. Don't use exclusive words that have F for no reason. Okay? If you're going to single out people, you better have a good reason to do it. Otherwise, you use neutral terms so that you can be more inclusive and more of your audience will be involved in will be open to the issues you're discussing. Again, that's not being politically correct. That's being an effective communicator. Okay, what we have next is problem solution speeches. Problem solution speeches. Okay, remember problem. The outline of the standard way to shape a problem solution speech is problem solution. Remember, there's two parts to the problem: cause and effect. It is perfectly okay to do effect and cause when organizing the speech, and your solution breaks down into two parts: practicality and efficacy. Know what practicality is, know what efficacy is. Well, that was pretty simple. Moving on, we talked about listening. Be aware of the difference between listening and hearing. Okay? Remember, where is it? Blaine Goss's model. Okay? And Blaine Goss's model from back in 2009 came across a radical concept in listening, that it was an information process. Be aware of that. Now, also be aware of the old model, the linear model, where listening broke down into 4 stages: receiving, understanding, remembering, and evaluation. Okay? Be aware of that as well. Okay? We talked about listening styles: people-focused, action-focused, content-focused, time-focused. We talked about some impediments to listening as well. Okay. Hey, we're almost done. Okay. So we talked about persuasive speaking last. We talked about the difference between coercion and persuasion. Coercion is, changing attitudes through threat. Okay. Persuasion allows for free will. Coercion is not ethical. Persuasion is ethical. Okay? We talked about obstacles to changing attitudes, selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure, and the degree of commitment. Okay? And public commitment. Be aware of selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure, degree of commitment, and public commitment. You might, you might see a question on the final that says so-and-so is exhibiting this behavior. Is that selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure? Okay? We talked about methods of changing attitudes. Build a case with evidence and logic, foot in the door in the face, show your proposal is consistent with current existing attitudes, or appeal to an alternate value system. Okay? We also talked about two that we don't really look at: arouse fear and offer a reward. Those are possible, but you have to be very careful with those. Please be aware why you need to be careful with those. Okay? Then we talked about the two basic styles, one-sided and two-sided. Okay? I feel like a blackjack dealer in Vegas now. Just clearing my hands. Okay, so that's what you got. Historic day today. Birth of the National League in April 22nd, 1876, 143 years ago. Again, love the, I've always had a bit of a like for the Oakland Athletics because they were a very working class team. Always loved the Atlanta Braves because way back in the 1960s, 70s, when I was growing up, they were about it as far as professional teams in the South. We're not going to discuss the Saints. So it was two great teams, gave birth to the National League, which ultimately led us to Major League Baseball, which is a sport I greatly love. So go out and when you finish studying, you got the Green Jackets here in town. You can always watch baseball on TV. So study for your final. Be aware of the dates the finals are going to be on. And, after that, go watch a baseball game. All right, that's 22 minutes of your time. And if you do all of that, you're going to do great on the final. And we will see you there.